least. So Abby from the library asked me to begin our session today. She is here, but she is staying off camera for now, since she is outside and managing her kids as well. So I just wanted to begin by thanking Abby and the Summit Library for all of their support and work in sponsoring this lecture series. And I also just wanted to mention again that in the chat, you'll see, just like I've been sharing with you before, this is the link to the website I created just for this series of lectures on my website. And again, the link includes a section for each week, and that includes the PowerPoint slides that I share. It also includes, after the session occurs, the recording, and it includes lots and lots of recommended resources. So I hope you're taking advantage of that. So Abby, if you could just keep muting people upon entry, that would be great. I don't think that's automatically happening. So if you can just set it to, as people enter, if they can be, or just do a mute all and I can unmute myself. I think there's a few little things going on with some background noise. And I see there's a question about the slides. I can come back to that in a second. Okay, great. So it looks like everybody is muted. And again, as a reminder, this session is recorded. So in order to find the slides so what I can do is I'll just share in a moment, make sure I actually have everything here. Yeah, okay, great. So here's what I'll do. Right before I share my slides, I will share the website and just show you real quick where you can find everything. So again, this session is being recorded. We'll record the portion where I'm sharing my slides. Then we're going to take a break. And then you're going to be in a breakout room, just like last time. That will not be recorded. Then we're going to come back together and hear about your conversation in your breakout rooms. And that final reporting back and discussion will be recorded. So again, thank you to the Summit Library for sponsoring this series. I just want to remind you, if you, again, are not sure how to find the chat, just put your cursor at the very bottom of the screen and you'll see the chat button right there. So just click on it and then you'll see the chat open up on the right. And just one more time, I'm going to post the link to the website that I created for you so that you can see the materials and slides there. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll show you that website real quick, and then we'll switch over to my slides. So just briefly, this is the website that I created for this particular lecture series. It includes the overarching questions that we're talking about. And then it has week 1 at the top. It has the PowerPoint slides and the video from last week. It has lots of resources for that first week. And then week 2, the link to the slides are here. The video from last week is here. And then more resources. Then week 3, today's slides are here. The link obviously is not here yet because the recording is in progress, but after I receive that link, I'll add it here. And there are more sources for today, and then I will do the same for next time. So I hope that helps clarify how to find everything. Okay, great. So I am just going to share my slides here. So this is week 3 of Dismantling the Racism Machine. And again, this is a lecture series sponsored by the Summit Free Public Library. So just a little reminder about what we've already been doing. So this is our 3rd week out of 4, and we're focusing in this whole series on myths taught to white people that need to be debunked in order to challenge systemic racism. And so last week we talked, the first week we talked about the myth that human races are biologically different, or in other words, that race is biological. Last week, we focused on the myth that race has always existed, that whiteness has always existed, and debunk that with the idea that race is actually an invention or a social construct. Today, we're going to be talking about the persistence of systemic racism after the civil rights movement. And then next week, we're going to shift into a discussion more about action and activism and applying the work that we've been doing these several weeks. So again, just to do a little bit more review, because everything that we're doing today is based on the work that we've already done. And as a reminder, if you missed last week or the first week, go back into the website, watch the recording, go through the slides, and that'll help give you a foundation. So again, in our first 2 weeks together, we focused on two myths that white people in particular are indoctrinated into that uphold white supremacy. The myth that race is biological and the myth that race has always existed. And so, well, why are we worrying about these myths? Well, if we believe these myths, then we take them for granted. We see them as normal. So we don't question laws and policies and culture and media and actions and court decisions and all kinds of behavior that result from these myths. We normalize them and see them as the only way of doing things. However, if, as I hope we've been, starting to understand, if we recognize these myths as myths, then we can start to reflect on how we've been indoctrinated into them and work on unindoctrinating or deprogramming, as somebody else mentioned, ourselves. And then that'll help prep us for next week's conversation about action. And so you might remember at the end of last week in the breakout sessions, I asked us to think about what can you do to develop a daily practice of catching yourself slipping into the myth. And last week it was specifically the myth that race has always existed, recognizing that it is a myth, and instead see race as an invention or a social construct, and consciously pulling yourself out of this myth. So we talked about some strategies for that, because that is the one of the foundations of developing an anti-racist mindset. Today, we're going to take the next step and look at our third and final myth. And this is the myth that racism occurred in the past, but that problem has been resolved. We might hear things like slavery is over, or the civil rights movement ended racism, or we elected a Black president, so racism must be over. Well, the reality, of course, is that systemic racism continues to be a serious problem in the US today. So why on earth has systemic racism persisted decades after the civil rights movement? Well, some people might say, well, why on earth would you even ask such a question? After all, the civil rights movement accomplished so much in the 1950s and 1960s. There was the Montgomery bus boycott and all of the lunch counter sit-ins. There was the Brown decision mandating that separate but equal is no longer constitutional when it comes to schools. There was, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then the same year, the Immigration and Nationality Act. And then a few years later, the Fair Housing Act. These were incredibly powerful pieces of legislation that made significant changes. And institutions and facilities could no longer say whites only. So all of these things happened. 5 decades later, where exactly are we? So yes, the civil rights movement created these massive cultural and legal changes. And yes, we elected a Black president. But at the same time, systemic racism persists at significant and in some cases even worsening levels. So I'd like for us to look at a few examples: housing segregation, school segregation, and maternal and infant mortality. And so some people might say, well, what is the evidence for the persistence of systemic racism? Well, considering these particular examples, let's take a look. So I'm pulling just a few headlines from articles just as a strategy for highlighting the persistence of systemic racism. So when it comes to housing segregation, 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was signed, America is nearly as segregated as it was when President Lyndon Johnson signed the law. So segregation persists. And some people might say, well, that's not about race. It really is just about class. And actually, that's just not the case. Yes, we need to pay attention to class, but we cannot ignore race. So here's just an example from the Washington Post. Poor whites live in richer neighborhoods than middle-class Blacks and Latinos. And so if we only focus on class, we miss some key factors when it comes to the persistence of racism and its impact on people. White people with lower wealth, lower income are still more likely to live in a neighborhood with more resources and access to various kinds of opportunities because they're white. And that those opportunities, that access to wealth is just not available in the same way to Black people, to Latinx people, and to other people of color. Okay, so let's also think about school segregation, because housing segregation and school segregation are very much connected. So racial school segregation has actually gotten a lot worse since the 1980s. The number of schools with almost all white children has increased. And then the flip side, the number of schools with almost all children of color has also increased. And there's various national studies that show this. Since we're here in New Jersey, sponsored by a library in New Jersey, I do want to make sure we're paying attention to segregation in New Jersey. And I've said this before, but as a reminder, New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in the entire country, with one of the most segregated school systems in the entire country. And Rutgers University did a report back in 2013 that looked in detail at this problem, and they explicitly identified New Jersey as having what they called, quote, apartheid levels of school segregation in New Jersey, and also, quote, hyper segregated levels of school segregation. So you can Google that and find that report. It is very comprehensive and is a bit of a wake-up call, especially for white people that I think often in New Jersey don't really want to face the reality of the persistence of systemic racism. Okay, so let's also take a look at another area where systemic racism persists in really profound ways. Now, we did talk about this a bit during the first week when we talked about the persistence of the myth that race is biological, and it very much connects to the crisis of maternal mortality. So I'm just gonna highlight this here. Quote, more women die in the US from pregnancy-related complications than in any other developed country. Racial disparities in maternal mortality are staggering. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related complication than non-Hispanic white women. And so we talked about during that first week how Black women's pain is not believed in the same way as white women's pain. And this is seen in many aspects of healthcare in the US. And the roots of it, as we talked about, go back to a fundamental false ideology that white and Black people are biologically different, and that Black people biologically feel less pain than white people. And that is simply just not true. But not only is it false, it is an incredibly dangerous myth that we've had persist for centuries now. And this is the kind of impact that it continues to make. So there's a lot of research done about this, this crisis. It relates to the crisis of infant mortality, where, quote, white educated women, American women, lose their infants at rates similar to mothers in America's peer countries. Across the United States, Black infants die at a rate that's more than twice as high as that of white infants. So we see the same kind of racial disparity when it comes to the loss of infants as when we hear about maternal mortality. So again, whether it's housing, schooling, healthcare, we see the persistence of systemic racism in the US today. And so I just want to highlight a few other systems that we might keep in mind, because I don't want to make it seem like those are the only kinds of examples. So one example is when we think about access to employment opportunities. And so there was a relatively famous study, and it's been done again since then, where they take identical resumes and they put either a white sounding name or a black sounding name at the top of it. And in case after case, in city after city, when this has been done, the resumes that have the white sounding name are far more likely to receive a callback than the resume with the black sounding name, even though the actual content of the resume is identical. Also, the Washington Post has this headline: the black-white economic divide is as wide as it was in 1968. So we have employment, we have the economy, we have how that connects to education. African Americans with college degrees are twice as likely to be unemployed as other graduates. And then we're back to healthcare. Native Americans feel invisible in US healthcare systems. Why COVID-19 disproportionately impacts Latino communities. And as coronavirus spreads, so does xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. So we can see the persistence of systemic racism across various racial groups and in multiple systems. And here are just a few other examples. Race best predicts whether you live near pollution. Environmental racism extends far beyond Flint. So if you have not heard the term environmental racism before, that's a term that you probably want to become aware of, because it describes something that we might not even, white people especially, might not even really think very much about. That people, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are much more likely to live in an area that is affected by pollution or other sort of toxins. And that has a significant impact on health, on housing, on so many things. Voter suppression. Voter suppression is warping democracy. Black and Hispanic citizens are more likely than whites to face barriers at the polls and to fear the future erosion of their basic political rights. And again, that's a headline from the magazine, The Atlantic. So electoral politics and voting, another huge system where we can see the persistence of systemic racism today. We also need to take into account the media and popular culture. This report came out of the organization Color of Change, that this organization is incredibly, I think incredibly powerful in the sort of work that it's doing in a variety of systems. But they issued this report, Normalizing Injustice, the Dangerous Misrepresentations That Define Television's Scripted Crime Genre. So they studied dozens, if not hundreds, of episodes of our favorite police procedurals over the past several years, and found that there are a lot of false beliefs getting perpetuated, a lot of myths getting perpetuated that normalize the idea that the criminal justice system is fair, and normalize the way that white officers in particular are able to essentially carry out some of the ideologies, the racial ideologies we've been talking about. And so if you get a chance, check out that report. It's included on my website for resources for you. Other aspects of popular culture and the media, Latinos on screen, conspicuously few. Why won't Hollywood cast Asian actors? So these relate directly to the idea that representation matters when it comes to film, when it comes to popular culture. So again, that's another very large system where we can see the persistence of systemic racism. So in other words, we can look at any system that we have, and there's many I haven't even mentioned, and see how racism persists. Okay, so if hopefully we recognize that it is persisting, then the question is why? Because wasn't the civil rights movement supposed to address all of this? Why are we back here in 2020? So there are a lot of answers that we might come up with for that. I'm going to suggest 3 of them. So one is that the systemic racism that was already there before the civil rights movement ultimately did not get fully dismantled. It might have gotten partially dismantled, but then maybe built back up a little bit in a way that looks a little bit different. So in other words, the systemic racism embedded in our institutions and structures before the civil rights movement continued afterwards. And one of the legal scholars who influenced me the most when I first started reading and researching this work more than 20 years ago was Derek Bell. And unfortunately, he has since passed, but he is considered a founding member of the field called critical race theory, which comes out of the legal studies area. And he talked about the fact that even though the Supreme Court in the 1950s and 60s under Chief Justice Earl Warren is often seen as being extraordinarily progressive and open-minded about changing systemic racism, that is actually not the case. So Bell writes, the civil rights decisions of the Warren Court were profoundly conservative and protected the economic and political status quo by responding to the pleas for justice by Blacks and other severely disadvantaged groups just enough to siphon off discontent, thereby limiting the chances that the existing social order would pay more than the minimal costs for the reforms achieved. So I think that, I know it's a long quote, but I think it's really powerful because it gives us a different perspective than we might normally get about some of these legislative changes. Rather than significant change that disrupts the status quo, he says the changes made were fairly minor and did not ultimately change the status quo. Another way that he puts this is, we have made progress in everything, yet nothing has changed. So that's something I'd like for us to think about. Okay, so one way of thinking about how systemic racism and the institutions and structures that supported racism before the civil rights movement persists today, one way that we can think about that is the issue of racial segregation. So the institutions and structures that were in place in the 1920s and 30s have still a profound influence on us today. So we can think about that in the context of redlining. So you may be familiar with this concept, but if not, here is just sort of a sample. This happened in cities all over the country, especially in the North. But here's an example from Atlanta. So this is a map of Atlanta, Georgia in 1938. And you can see in this image, there are different parts of the city in different colors. And so that in this particular case, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, sometimes referred to as the HOLC, this was a federal agency, and they created maps of many, many different cities. And they literally colored in different parts of the city depending on how they interpreted the level of risk for that mortgage, for that loan. So the sections marked in red were considered the highest risk for mortgages. And these were almost always predominantly Black communities. And so this became known as this concept of redlining, but it comes from the map literally being in red, marking Black communities in red, identifying their risk as the highest risk. Sometimes the language of hazardous was also used when it came to the risk of getting a mortgage or getting a loan. So this had a profound impact on basically the lack of opportunity to build wealth, to purchase a home, and to contribute towards intergenerational wealth. So this is one reason why the racial wealth gap today is so wide, and we'll get to that in a second. Also, what was going on a little bit later, is a little bit more post World War II, but also before the Civil Rights Movement, is that the new suburban developments, new suburban communities that became so popular right after World War II, many of them explicitly were for white people only. So this is from one of the most famous ones, Levittown. This is from the Levittown lease, the corporation lease in 1948. So if you bought your house, you had to abide by this and you had to agree to this. So, quote, the tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race, but the employment and maintenance of other than Caucasian domestic servants shall be permitted, end quote. In other words, only white people were allowed to buy these new suburban houses, but they could still employ Black servants, housekeepers, maids, and other people of color to provide services, gardening and cooking and that sort of thing. So the racial hierarchy that we talked a lot about last week is directly embedded in the housing segregation that is emerging right after World War II. So I want us to keep both of these kinds of things in mind as we understand and look at the racial wealth gap today, because housing contributes significantly to intergenerational wealth. All right, so the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice is an organization I've mentioned before. I think they are, one of the organizations in New Jersey doing the most effective analysis about the persistence of systemic racism in New Jersey. So they recently put together this image. They've shared it a lot in social media. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, I would urge you to follow them. They also have an excellent website, again, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And on the left-hand side, you'll see this is the gap in household wealth. So we're not talking about income. This is about wealth, which directly goes back to assets like your house. So on the left-hand side is the national racial wealth gap. So you can see that white households on average have $171,000, Black households on average $17,600, Latina households on average $20,700. Okay, so that's at the national level, which is bad enough. But as the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice shows us quite clearly here, on the right-hand side, this is the situation in New Jersey. The wealth gap, as they say, is a disaster. So the white median household wealth is one of the highest, if not the absolute highest, in all of the country at $352,000. And then Black and Latino wealth is significantly less than what it is nationally. So there are lots of reasons for this that relate specifically to New Jersey. I am not an expert in these sorts of details. The website for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice does a great job of sharing information about this and giving action items to address this. But I will point out that the way New Jersey is structured when it comes to our property taxes and how our school system is set up are directly related to this, among other things. Okay, so also in thinking about why has systemic racism persisted after the civil rights movement, in addition to recognizing that the structures in place before persisted after, on top of that, there were also new ways of maintaining systemic racism that emerged as part of the backlash to the civil rights movement. So one of these that you may be familiar with is in the 1960s, especially the FBI's counterintelligence program that was under Director Edgar Hoover. So this was called COINTELPRO. And basically, this was a program that conducted surveillance, infiltration, intimidation on a variety of civil rights organizations and civil rights leaders, and attempted to break apart alliances between groups, especially multiracial or interracial alliances. There was, the FBI was very concerned about groups coming together, about Black civil rights groups working with poor whites, working with Asian Americans, working with Mexican Americans, working with indigenous peoples. And so they did a lot to attempt to divide and conquer these groups so that they would not form a powerful coalition. And more evidence of this sort of intimidation has come to light in the years since then. Okay, something else that I think is extremely important that does not really get a lot of attention, at least in my observations, is a couple of Supreme Court decisions. So in 1976, the Supreme Court decided that if a law has a racially discriminatory impact, but no documented intent to discriminate, then that's fine. So in other words, you have to be able to prove intent, and the impact doesn't matter, even if it is a racially disproportionate impact. So that's a serious problem. And then on top of that, a little more than 10 years later, there was a similar approach used by the Supreme Court when they decided a case related to sentencing. So racially biased sentencing is okay, constitutional, if there is no documented intent to discriminate. And finding proof of intent to discriminate can be extremely challenging, especially when people are using coded language, race-neutral language, to describe something, even though the intent is very much there. But if there's no proof of it, then the law is constitutional. So that's really, really powerful. And again, not something I don't think we spend enough time recognizing that. Okay, we talked about this last week, but I do want to mention it again just to kind of keep it on your radar. So divide and conquer stereotypes. This also relates to the COINTELPRO activity, but in the 1960s and after, divide and conquer stereotypes were deployed to break interracial coalitions and to maintain the status quo. And I like to draw a parallel between that and what happened in a response to the Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, where people we would call white, people we would call Black, who were rebelling together, were essentially divided and conquered by the invention of race and by the language that we talked about last week. Okay, so another area that I want us to think about breaks down into a couple of different categories. So again, just to recap, we talked about the first reason that systemic racism persists after the civil rights movement is that the institutional structures that reinforced racism continued. The second was that new things were happening as part of the backlash to the civil rights movement that reinforced the status quo of systemic racism. And then there's some additional things to keep in mind, additional factors protecting the status quo. So one of them is, even though, of course, it's an important thing that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires the removing of whites-only signs of Jim Crow segregation. But if we think about it, what happens if an institution takes down that whites-only sign, but then not a lot else changes? We have perhaps a superficial veneer of equality, but the internal structure is still supporting systemic racism, but it's a little harder to point to the evidence for that racism when the whites-only sign isn't on that door anymore. So that becomes a new kind of challenge. In addition, in the past couple of decades, most people would say that being racist is bad, and most people do not want to be called a racist. At the same time, as many of them actually are upholding racism. And so they know that being called racist is bad, but yet perpetuating systemic racism is still built into the status quo. We've also seen a significant rise in law and order rhetoric as a response to the civil rights movement. I included a link to my, I did a 4-part blog series on my website about the idea, the recent language of defunding the police. And I give a little bit of history about policing. I think a lot of people were really taken aback by this language of defunding the police. And so I really was trying to kind of break this down and to show that since the civil rights movement, spending at the local, state, national level on policing has gone up, you know, dramatically at the same time as spending on almost all social services has gone down. And so that's something we'll talk about in a minute, but that goes hand in hand with the rise of law and order rhetoric, which incidentally is the name of a popular TV show. And I would say that's not a coincidence. All right. So if we think more about what has been happening in the past 10 years, we also hopefully know that there is this increase in white fear of white people becoming a statistical minority. And that fear is getting stoked and stoked in many, many different ways, as I'm sure you've seen. And that connects directly to the rise of the alt-right and the effect they've had, their connections to the rise in white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and various aspects of white supremacy. If you're interested in understanding more about that, I included a link to a fairly recent book about the notion of a white ethno-state and the racial ideology that supports that, which is a really powerful analysis. Okay, so a couple of other things to keep in mind. And this is something, again, I'd really like for us to think about. So after the civil rights movement, one of the things that happened is that the narrative about race can get sort of flipped upside down, as it were. And so I'm going to give you 2 examples. One relates to notions of fraud. So there's, first of all, just to be clear, there's no evidence that there's welfare fraud. There's no evidence that there's voter fraud on any sort of large scale. Any evidence of either is minuscule. But this mythical fraud is represented as real fraud committed by Black people, Latinx people, other people of color. And then once people start to get, white people especially, start to become convinced voter fraud is real, welfare fraud is real, then legislative changes, court changes actually limit services, limit voting rights based on not an actual fraud, but a mythical fraud. And this leads to extremely serious problems like voter suppression, which we're seeing in many of the primaries that have been going on. And that we saw in significant changes to access to welfare, especially under Bill Clinton's administration. Okay, so again, that the narrative being flipped is one, this is one example of that. And another example relates to a question that came up last week, and that is perceptions about affirmative action. So on the one hand, affirmative action is intended to help compensate for historical oppression and lack of access to opportunity. Okay, but white people see it as quote unquote reverse racism that harms them. And so that's where the narrative is getting turned upside down. And so white people, when they see this and identify it as reverse racism, which just to be very clear, I don't believe is a thing, white people are ignoring the history of affirmative action for white people. So the history of the United States is filled with examples where white people were the only people that were given access to all kinds of opportunities. We talked about a lot of this last week. And so here's just one example that affects us today. So elite colleges and universities, a couple of them have changed their policy, but most of them still have what is usually referred to as legacy admissions, where the children of alumni are given preference to admission into that elite college or university. And white students, white families are much more likely to already have a family history with a particular college or university, and are therefore much more likely to benefit from this. And just to give you a quick example, so at Harvard, if you are a legacy applicant, meaning if one of your parents went to Harvard, then you have a 33% chance of getting accepted. If you're just sort of a general applicant, then you only have a 6% chance of getting accepted. So when we talk about affirmative action, we tend to focus solely on affirmative action in the context of race and ignore it in its history and in the context of so many other things. And something else to consider, which you may have come across, is that the divide and conquer stereotype I talked about last week of Asian Americans as the quote unquote model minority, that stereotype when it comes to school and education and students and affirmative action specifically, that stereotype is used to pit Asian Americans against Black and Latinx students. And again, that is part of the strategy for maintaining the status quo of systemic racism. Keep racialized groups divided so that they cannot form alliances. While the reality is that plenty of research shows that there is actually a lot of support for affirmative action by Asian American communities, but that is not what gets put into, that's not what gets represented in the media. What gets represented are the small number of Asian American organizations that support some of the white people who are trying to focus on this idea of reverse racism, that affirmative action is reverse racism. And I talk about that more in my book, and there's plenty of scholarship out there about all of this. So again, I just want us to think about this larger concept of narratives about race get sort of turned upside down in the past, since the civil rights movement. And that's another way to maintain the status quo. I will also mention, and again, this doesn't get the attention that it should, is that even though white women are the biggest beneficiary of affirmative action, they are actually its biggest critics. So white women are much more likely to say that affirmative action is bad and is on the basis of race, this notion of reverse racism, even though white women have benefited significantly from affirmative action in the context of gender. So that's something just to keep in mind. And I included an article about that on our page. Okay, so the last area that I'd like for us to talk about, and then we'll come back together, is a word you may have heard before, and if not, that's okay. That is the language of neoliberalism. And this is a movement that has really developed over the past couple of decades. And to me, it goes hand in hand with the backlash to the civil rights movement, and is another reason why systemic racism has persisted, even though it's not always connected. So here are a couple of ways of thinking about the rise of neoliberalism over the past few decades. So there's been an increased focus on the individual rather than the collective. And some might say that was already, baked into the idea of American identity. And I understand that, but it's even more so in the past couple of decades. A shift to privatization. Okay, so privatizing healthcare, privatizing education, privatizing things rather than have them supported by the public. A growing gap between the rich and the poor. So we saw a lot of attention to this through the Occupy Wall Street movement and the notion of the 1%. And that language of the 1% is still very much with us. The idea that the 1%, the top 1% has benefited financially to an extreme, and essentially the 99% of everybody else has not benefited, and their status is often getting worse and worse. So we also have stagnant wages for the average worker. So you might have seen the documentary Inequality for All that Robert Reich did several years ago. I thought that was a really helpful way of understanding some of these issues in an accessible way. And he talks about how since the 70s, wages for the average worker, when you take everything else into consideration, have pretty much stayed the same, whereas compensation for the executives, for people at the top, have gone up, exorbitantly. And it's not a surprise that all of this relates to a decrease in unions. Also not a surprise, this is connected to a rise in corporate power due to deregulation, which of course is connected. I mean, all of this is sort of like a giant vicious circle. If corporations have more influence in politics, then they're able to lobby Congress to deregulate, which in turn makes the corporations more powerful, and then the whole thing just keeps spinning. And a lot of people would say, well, what on earth does this have to do with racism? To me, it's about preserving the status quo and putting into place structures that make it even harder to challenge the status quo. I mentioned before the cuts to spending of education, healthcare, social services, all different kinds of things we think about when we think about and understand the public good. So just a quick example, I'm a professor at a community college here in New Jersey, and the funding that we get, whether it's from the county government or from the state government, has significantly gone down over the past decade or so, and or at least the ratio has gone down, so that students have a much greater responsibility to contribute to our operational budget than before. And that's just not the way a public college is supposed to be, and this is happening throughout the country. So these sorts of things are seen as an individual responsibility. It's your individual responsibility to pay for college, to pay for healthcare, to pay for access to whatever services you might need, rather than coming together as a collective and seeing these as part of the public good. Okay, so just to review, again, the question is, why has systemic racism persisted after the civil rights movement? So we have, again, the systems in place before the civil rights movement continued afterwards. We have new ways of maintaining systemic racism developed as part of the backlash. And then we have a couple of additional factors that I talked about that continue to protect the status quo of systemic racism. So we have all of these things sort of coming together, influencing each other to maintain systemic racism. But the false myths obscure this reality. And so just coming back to the myths that I mentioned before, we have the myth that racism occurred in the past and that problem has been resolved. We have the myth that the civil rights movement ended racism. These myths obscure the reality of systemic racism today. All right, so in a moment, I'm going to stop sharing my slides. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and do a breakout discussion just like we did last week. So I want to just give you the question now so you can start to ponder it. So keep in mind, next week is our last week, and so we'll be focusing more on shifting to action then. So today, I want us to continue to talk about building this anti-racist mindset. So what I'm going to ask you to think about today there's two questions. How can you work on being able to recognize the persistence of systemic racism today and not get caught in believing the myth that systemic racism is over? And then how do you avoid blaming individuals for situations that are actually caused by systemic racism? So after we take a break, we're going to come back. You'll be automatically placed into a breakout room. The breakout room discussion will not be recorded, just as a reminder. I'm going to ask you to very quickly identify a facilitator and to very, very briefly introduce yourselves. Mention maybe just your name and your town. Focus instead on talking about these two questions. And at the end of that, the facilitator will share a highlight or two with all of us so we can hear a little bit about what went on in every room. And just as a reminder, try to remember the breakout room number that you're in, because that's how we'll hear back from everybody. So I am going to stop sharing my slides. Okay, and here we are still. So